Good morning, and thanks very much for tuning in Hometown Cable. And this program, again, of course, is What's Going On Here. I'm Bob Venn, and I want to welcome you to tonight's show. I say it'll be tonight. You're watching it tonight. And we're going to give you something unusual right at the beginning. We're going to give you a 1-minute commercial here, or two half-a-minute commercials, so you can call your friends, call your neighbors, your relatives, and get your VCRs hooked up, because this program tonight is going to be on railroads in the northern tier, particularly the town of Champlain, which includes the village of Champlain and, of course, the seat there of railroading in Rouses Point. And Peg Barcomb is here to show us hundreds of pictures and a story about old railroading. And don't forget that watch this commercial while you're doing this, because our sponsors are the ones that make these programs possible to you, and also you patrons who have sent in your $12 or more. Very much appreciated by Hometown Cable. So we'll take this 1-minute break now, and when you come back, you're going to be hearing a lot about railroads. Well, we hope all your machines are set. And if you don't have a machine, or you want a real good copy of this, don't forget that Hometown Cable has copies available of not only this program, but every program. It'll cost you $15. That includes the tape and the plus tax. And you get yourself a copy right off the original. What we have planned for the next at least three, and possibly even 4 weeks, is railroading in the northern tier. The first program is going to be today. You're watching it right now. We're going to see these hundreds of pictures and some of the other things that are around here that Peg has brought, and has worked very hard to get you started on what the importance of railroading in our area, and just the romance of railroading. That's a familiar expression, Peg. And then we're going to be talking with people at the yard office in the D&H in Rouses Point, on the corner of Pratt and was it Washington, Montgomery area there next to the yard. We'll be talking with 2 or 3 people in there. We're going to be talking with Mr. Beaumier, the president of the NJ Railroad, the Napierville Junction, who also is stationed in that building. We're going to be talking to the people from the CN Railroad. That's some of the Turners and Bruce Wallet and so forth. We're going to be going over to the roundhouse and the turntable, and we're going to see the southern yard. Then we're going to be going out to the northern yard, out in amongst the trains, and show you some of the switches. And then we're going to be talking to some people who have retired from the railroad. We're going to try and get 8 or 10 people who can have a round table discussion and explain. And then to top it all off, we're in the process of getting permission to take a trip on the D&H South and get some pictures from the train from here down to Willsboro. That's in the works. We have to get permission, and that's still questionable right now. But stay tuned for the next 2 or 3 or 4 weeks in addition to tonight, and we hope you enjoy it. And if you do, let Calvin know, let me know, and don't forget to call Peg and let her know that you like her part. Now we're talking to Peg. Peg Barcomb, the historian, and before we get into that, we've heard Peg's history before, but let's hear the history of railroad in Peg's family.
Well, my dad worked in the 20s on the section for the D&H for Louis Valenzi, and he only worked as a spare. If there was a big snowstorm or something, he would be called. It wasn't his regular job. And he worked for Hector Como, who was on the CN. He was the boss, section boss on the CN. And later he worked in the pit, over in the CV pit, which is long gone.
What's a pit?
That's where they cleaned out the ashes and all from the engines, put them in there and cleaned them and got them ready for the next. Loaded them with coal and so on for the next.
In other words, when you burn coal, you've got ashes left over, and you can't drop that along the.
They're not ashes; they're cinders.
Oh, the cinders from the you can't drop those along the track, because they would burn the cross ties, right, in between the rails.
There would be so many anyway that you would have to go to one spot to.
There's an awful lot of them.
This pit.
Okay.
So then, after he worked there, he went out on the Rutland Railroad Bridge, and before they closed, they had 3 shifts, of course, and he was one of the last 3 of the bridge tenders on the Rutland before it folded up. And my husband worked 17 years on a section of the D&H, and my brother Bob was an engineer on the NJ, and he was the youngest engineer, by the way, on the whole East Coast. He was 24 years old when he was made an engineer. And in
Wow,
them
what a
days,
thrill
when
that
you were
was.
a steam engineer, you had to learn a book of rules and so on. Today, they go punch a few buttons and take one trip, and they're qualified for a diesel. But it wasn't that way with the steam. And when he knew he was an engineer, we were in the railroad station. He was just getting ready to leave. He was in the service, and he'd come home from his basic, and he was getting ready to leave to go. He was going to Battle of the Bulge. I knew, but my mother didn't know. And they came up and handed him his diploma where he had been made an engineer. And then his son followed in his footsteps and was an engineer on the NJ, Billy Maskell, for quite a few years before he left. My brother-in-law worked in the D&H almost all of his life. He started as a fireman, and he ended up in the D&H station in Albany as a sort of a porter, janitor, whatever. And he worked his whole railroad life there, all his working years there too. So we've had quite a few railroaders.
And the very important one, you've even ridden on trains, right?
Oh, sure.
All right.
These names, she hasn't said her father's name?
Oh, yeah, her father's name and your husband's name was Peter,
My husband's name was Peter Barcomb. My
And your-
father is Phil Bedard.
right?
Who is almost 94, and he still can tell you about his railroad days as if it was yesterday.
Is that right? Now, this is just one person we're talking about and how railroads have been important in her life, from her father to her brother and her husband and other relatives, just in little Rouses Point here. And we're talking, there's hundreds of people that can tell you things like this, and this is why that Calvin and I decided, along with Peg, that we should have a story of railroad, if not only to watch it now, but for a historical record of the very important romance of railroads. And thank you much, Peg, and now we can start on what we had planned on doing and all the work you've done.
Well, and I want to say also that now I got most of my information. I go down and I copy off the videotapes down at the library or the college. I copy the stories that are in the old newspapers. Then I get railroad books, and this is how, and from hearsay. So if somebody can contradict a story that I told, I hope they call me, because I'd like to correct my records. Already Calvin and Bob have done this, and I appreciate it, because it's true. This is history, and it should be as right as we can get it. So if there's some thing that I say, a date or something that's wrong, I'd appreciate it if anyone would let me know that I've done it wrong, because that's the only way I can correct it. I have to take it from somebody else. So.
All right. If I make any mistakes, tell me, but don't tell my wife. I get enough hassle from her anyway. All right.
All right. We'll start with 1836. Some Boston investors decided that there should be a railroad from Ogdensburg to Boston. They decided Ogdensburg for the simple reason Prescott, Ontario is just across the St. Lawrence, and that is the narrowest part of the St. Lawrence to cross. Also in Canada, the railroads already came up to Prescott, so they wanted to get a railroad through there. So that the timber and the grain were the big commodities that they wanted to get down to Boston. So they started selling stocks as early as 1836. And they had to raise $2 million, and they sold the stocks at $50 a share. They even sold some here in Champlain. Plattsburgh got in the act and raised $50,000, hoping that the crossing of the lake would take place in Plattsburgh. But it wasn't feasible, so it ended up that the bridge came to Rouses Point. That's where they decided to put the bridge. So in 1845, they were granted a charter to build a railroad from Ogdensburg to Rouses Point. They still hadn't talked of the bridge. So on August 5th, 1847, they started the Northern Railroad. And they started at both ends. They started working at the Ogdensburg end, and they also started working at the Rouses Point end. Now, in the fall of 1848, from Rouses Point to Centerville, the line was open. Now, Centerville was Moore's Forks today. Then in 1849, they were as far as Ellenburg. And by 1850, in November, they had the whole 117 miles done right through from Rouses Point to Ogdensburg. So they put their first station, they had it out on the pier, which I will tell about later. But that was where they had their first station, Rouses Point. Second station was in Champlain. And then they had this was the Champlain station, which was the second station on the whole line. And the first locomotive that went the whole length of the line was called the Chazy. See, the old steam engines all had a name. They didn't use that name for telegraphy or anything. They used a number. There was a number on the engines. But they also had a name, and this one was the Chazy.
Now, Peg, as far as you know, the original station in Champlain was the one that was there up until...
As far as I know.
Right, when it never was replaced at any time, as far as you know. Okay.
Not that I know of.
And that was located, for you people that don't see it today, you know, is just up around the corner, I guess the Episcopalian Church, right across the road from the Episcopalian Church, and just up behind the Savoy there, that's Butternut Street, and then that's where the station was. And then it burned back in the 70s sometime. I think it was during a fiasco for one Halloween. It was owned by Richard Deso at that time. And now his son has taken the old baggage house or the storage building next door and made it a two-family apartment house in that area. That's what area we're talking about, and that's Champlain. Go ahead, Peg, excuse me.
So, no, that's great. Then there was an article in the paper that after 1,557,600 miles in 11 years on the Northern, no one was killed. And that was really a feat because of the burning wood and everything, and a new venture. But no one had been killed on that road. And George Hoyle of Champlain was the superintendent. And so it was an article giving him credit that the men were, so that there was no...
You said something. They burning wood?
The engines burned wood, yes.
Oh, they were wood tender type rather than coal.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. We kind of forget that maybe.
Well, talking about your wood, there was a Mr. McGregor who had the contract for the railroad, for the Northern, to furnish the wood. And he'd cut, or have his men cut, 40 cords a day of 4-foot wood. And they would stack it along the tracks. And as the train, you could see the big smokestack in this is the engine, one of the first engines that was on the Northern. And you can see the big smokestack right here. Mm-hmm. And you can see the wood in the tender.
This is the wood tender it's the first car beyond the engine. The engine actually stops right here. There's a coupling here. And that's where they had the wood, and the wood would go inside and push it into the whole burner.
The men did it. It didn't go automatic.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, we didn't mean to imply that.
There was no stoker like today. Then there was a fireman. There was the man that would get down there, get the wood, and he would push it into the furnace. It was into the boiler. It wasn't done automatically. But these stacks of wood would be all along the railroad, and as the train got to the stack of wood, it had to stop because there wasn't very much wood in that. They didn't go very far, so they would have to stop and get more wood. But can you imagine this man having men cut 40 cords of wood a day?
Now, for anybody you're burning wood again today, but let's just picture what a cord of wood is. It's 8 feet long, 4 feet high, and 4 feet from front to back. That's one cord. There were 40 of those a day just to run along that one track, right? Both ways. Every day.
The men were stationed at each place. These men were hired, I imagine, like Champlain, Ellenburg, so on, and they just put their pile of wood by the track right where they were. And
so the train stopped often.
The train stopped each place along the way, and then they had to replenish it for the next day
and
have
to load
some
up
more again. So now this is the front. It's just a Xerox, but it's the front of a timetable of 1899. It's February 26, 1899. I'm going to read you a list of the stations that was on this Northern Railroad when that timetable was in effect. It was Augsburg, Lisbon, Madrid, Norwood, Naps, Winthrop Brazier, Lawrence, Maria, Brushton, Bangor, Malone Junction, Burke, Chateauguay, Cherubusco, Clinton Mills, Brandy Brook, Ellenburg, Forest, Irona, Altona, Woods Falls, Moore's Forks, Moore's Junction, Whiteside's Siding, Champlain, and Rouses Point. Now there was an express passenger train on that line that took 4 hours and 10 minutes to get from Ogdensburg to Rouses Point. And that was an express now. That was a big one.
They still have to stop for wood, right?
Yeah. And they still
Yes.
made it in 4 hours and 10 minutes.
Mhm.
So and there was 8 trains a day going east, 5 freights and 3 passengers. Now this is what the timetable looked like. Just to give you an idea, I mean, the towns were all in the middle, and then it told what times the trains started and what times when they arrived and when they left for each station.
Now, the name Whiteside, we discussed that before. Whiteside, we don't know where that was, but it was before you got to Champlain itself, and there's a possibility that could be between Champlain and Perry's Mills. And Whiteside, I just got off the phone talking with Mrs. St. Maxon's, and she did not know what business they might have had. There was a Frank Whiteside, and he was the president of the local bank. He had a brother named John, and there's no record that we can find here today of what business that was, but it was called Whiteside. The Whitesides used to live where our present telephone office building is, where the convent was built on the main street on the curve. That whole area was the Whiteside location, and they just came across in Champlain. It was called here Whiteside.
I'm sure I have a letterhead that's Whiteside's business, but without looking it up, I don't remember what it was, but I will look it up. Now, as the railroad come down through, they got to what they called Dewey Cut. Now, this was 1848. They were in Dewey Cut, and there had been a bad drought in Ireland, and so they brought over a whole bunch of these Irishmen to come and help dig to make Dewey Cut. All over the United States, the railroads used Irishmen. They were noted for working on the railroads, and so that's how they got Dewey Cut through. And of course, you all know Dewey Tavern.
Well, I'm not so sure everybody knows it. The Dewey Tavern. Tell us about Dewey Tavern, where that's located.
Well, Dewey Tavern is just kitty corner across from the Central School, Champlain, and that was a stagecoach stop. The road came from Champlain Village to there, and then it turned and it went to Canada. There was no road to Rouses Point.
That's the old Prospect Hill. You go up past the Savoy and up, down around and up on the side of the high school. And then when you turned left onto 276, that house right across the road was the Dewey Inn.
Yeah, it was Dewey Inn. And Dewey Tavern. And the stagecoach stopped there, and people used to take potash on their backs and in wagons and however they could, and they took it into Canada and they sold it to buy the things that they really had to have that they needed money for. And they too would stop it there. That was the stopping point. And your Dewey Cut, if you left there and went south along 276, when you cross over down where the railroad tracks were, if you look either side of that road right there, that's Dewey Cut. And it was cutting right through rock. So that was a hard thing to build, but they got through it.
You know, potash, in talking about the history of this area, there was a lot of potash plants where you made potash, you burned wood, I guess, to do it, right? And they did that in Champlain and Shays, and a lot of businesses started along here with the potash, and then a lot of it was sent to Canada, you said.
Yeah, a lot of them took it to Canada. They brought their own, brought it over themselves.
Right.
And so you can imagine now, making that trip on foot with just what they could carry, or bring in any kind of a little wagon or whatever they could come up with and pull. They didn't use horses or anything. It was just, so that it's really something. This is just a waybill off the ONLC, which 1879. I've got the list of when these railroads changed names. It was the Northern, then it was the ONLC, and this is one of the waybills from there.
ONLC, the Ogdensburg and Lake Champlain.
Yes.
And it's a bill for $16 and $4 for another charge, a total bill of $20. And we can't read, the handwriting is as good as mine, we can't really read what was on this particular way bill. But it's just another historical item back in 1879.
Anything you find.
And we'll take a break here in 1879 and get right back to you. Stand by. What you're looking at is that frozen picture we have here of the Ogdensburg Lake Champlain Railroad, and it shows Ogdensburg, Lisbon, all those names that Peg mentioned from Ogdensburg all the way to Rouses Point. And getting back to this is from a book called The Rutland Road by a Jim Shaughnessy. I understand there's quite a few of these books around. These belong to my mother-in-law. Peg said she has a set, and at least 2 or 3 people have told me about this book that we might want to look at it. And I want to thank at this time also Mary Rasco and the Islander for running this short article on us the other day where we're looking for people. This is a month ago now when you're watching this, but I want to thank her for that and for other assistance that she's given us. This book is still available. It's in print. Peg mentioned and brought here, if you just let me get out of the camera range here. There's a place called the With Pipe and Book, Lake Placid, New York, and that Rutland Railroad book is still available.
And that's yesterday's book, so.
This has just arrived, this one here, right? Mm-hmm. Now, there's more books available than there are people from the Rutland Railroad. We haven't been able to find many people in our area. There are a few over in Vermont, I understand, we're trying to reach. This book today is still, and I think it's $40. When my father-in-law bought this, it was $10. So if you're going to get one, don't wait another 5 years. It'll be $50 by then. So it's just another book if you're interested in railroads. And there's also one on the Delaware and Hudson. And this is not listed in there. It may or may not be still available. This is pictures of all the old trains, pictures of Rouses Point and other communities along the route. And just want to bring that to your attention as we getting back now. Peg, go ahead.
All right, now I'll ask you a question.
Yes.
Explain what you meant to the people by a frozen picture.
Oh, a frozen picture. Calvin has taken a picture from that book, and he just froze his camera. He pushes a button, and that picture can stay there, yet we can talk in the background, and you don't see us, but now he just showed me something I didn't know, and maybe Calvin could explain that. What did you do, Calvin?
You gotta have the right camera.
You got to have the right camera, and I'm not sure he's telling us we don't have it, Peg, but you push the button, and the light didn't come on. I didn't know he was freezing the picture, so he could have that picture up there for a long time. He probably does some of that with his ads and so forth. He can do the same thing. And we hope that you're enjoying the show. You're watching what's going on here, and we're talking railroading in the northern tier. All right, Peg, you were telling us some more about our railroads.
Well, we keep jumping around, but we got to do this because there's so many things to say, and we tell you as we think about it. So,
not rehearsed, in other words.
No way. Anything or anytime you find anything on the O&LC Railroad, it's a real find because it's very, very scarce. This is 1/2 of an O&LC baggage tag. Now, there was 2, and they were on leather straps. And when you checked your baggage, they gave you one, and they put one on the handle of your suitcase. They both had the same number. When you went to get your suitcase, you turned in your baggage tag, and then they had a complete set for the next person.
Today you get a pressure-sensitive label.
Yeah, but these were brass, and that, as I say, it's an O&LC, so it's a kind of a rare one. Now, in Moores, the 15th of July, 1881, there was a bad accident. There was a little 3- and 4-year-old child that were killed by the train. They'd been playing in a culvert, and they came up on the track. And their names were Baxter and Huggins. I don't know if there's any families of that name anymore around this area, but there is Baxter's. But that was the name of those 2 children. Of course, they were killed instantly. And then in 1890, potatoes was a big commodity that was transferred by rail. And they were carrying up to 4,000 bushel a day just on the northern. So that was and just out of Ellenburg Depot, they'd send 4 and 5 boxcar loads at a time. So that's a lot of potatoes for the farmers to be bringing in.
Yep.
And they'd line up before the sun was up in the morning to unload their potatoes.
And they were going to the Boston,
They would go
Lincoln
down,
area?
yes, yeah. So then this is a picture of, to me, is Sheridan. It was Sheridan then. To you people, it's the Kimpex building. And you can see this was a railroad spur that went down in there, between there, and when they loaded and unloaded materials.
Right, now this building right here on the left, we think is still there, but it's been covered up by some of the new additions. And that was the old office building, and I understand that's where John Zerlo Sr. had his office, Calvin, when you worked at that, about right?
Right.
And then the railroad car went between, and the east, or the south rather, is this way. The road would be over here to your right, and the new building has been, I guess, enveloped this building here, the new one along the highway, along Elm Street. And then the other track was behind this office building, the main track. And here is
that's the main line.
the main line, as Peg says. The spur you just saw, the other picture was taken between this building and this one, and this is behind the old Sheridan building. The new section where you'd call the front, which is really in the back, and behind, is up in this area here. So north is where you're watching this picture, looking at the picture from, right? You're north, kind of a northwest. Some of that building is still there, right, Calvin? But it's been kind of circled around.
I'm getting glare on that long building in the back there. That's entrance is still there. That's door number 20 is over in the corner, and a lot of that wall is still there. The other part that we see here in the front, that's been kind of taken over by the engineering department, and now the curtain manufacturing.
Over here, huh?
Built around there and in front of there.
Okay. Is that still glaring where it is?
No, that's fine.
Okay. The Sheridan. Now, while we're talking about that, I have brought in a picture from a De Beers book of maps dated 1879. And Sheridan is located right in this area right here. I beg your pardon, up here. This is where that Sheridan was. And then this is the road that heads out toward Rouses Point, the highway here. And George Cameron used to live right in this corner here, and this is E Street that goes down to the South Rapids, right here. There was a railroad spur that came down through here and went across what is now Route 11. When Route 11 came across here, it's not in the picture, 100 years ago, and to this little development right down here, which is right along the water, and there were 17 to 20 homes and businesses down here, including a large lumber yard, and there were 2 or 3 sets of tracks. There's very little record of that now, as you can't tell. There are a couple pilings down in here that must be a result of that. And that's down where Mrs. Agnes Belrose was living. That's this little section right down in here. Very interesting. Gives a list of some of the merchants. And the area down there was called, it's very hard to read the names.
It's called Little Rapids now.
The Little Rapids Road is this road right here. There's a road that goes down, and right over in this area here is where Marcel Coupal had his farm. And right across the water is the Rainy Bayshard farm equipment. Right across from here is Rainy Bayshard farm equipment. And there's a regular little development in there. And now there's probably 3 or 4 homes. At that time there were as many as 17 different lots.
Now, there was another, before we get to that one, there was another accident on the railroad. It was between here and Ellenburg. I'm not quite sure just where it was. I remember the story, but I don't remember exactly which town. The train come through and killed a 7-year-old child who was playing on the track. And it made the mother lose her mind. So she tried to think of a scheme to get back at the railroad. So she put something on the track, and the next train that come through it derailed it, and she thought that she had got her revenge, but the revenge was the engineer on that train was not the one that had killed her child. So that was one of the sad stories that comes out of something like that.
You're talking what era there, back in the 1800s?
1890, 1895, in there. Yeah. And then also, of course, on the road, there was the milk trains, and there was some 20 trains a day, or 20 cars a day that went down on the road full of just the milk. So again, all the stations, the men would line up with their milk, waiting for the train to come in. So of course it was called the milk train. It had a number and all for railroad purposes, but to the locals, that was the milk train.
Remember, milk was in milk cans then. It was 40 quarts of milk in a milk can, weighed about 80 pounds, I believe it was, 80 to 100 pounds, all in milk cans.
Yeah. Now this, what you're showing there now, and some more of these, are an accident in Champlain. I believe right next to the station. I can't really pinpoint exactly where it was. Maybe somebody knows, because it was March 30th, 1916. So there's probably somebody that knows exactly where that spot was.
From looking at this and trying to get an idea, it apparently would be somewhere along between Prospect Street near the station and where Sheridan is today, or Kimpex, somewhere along and behind
Right in that area.
the central school, the elementary school. These are the smaller pictures, and this is, you saw just before, the larger picture.
The wooden cars you
was
talked about.
and they were wooden cars, and they just shatter. If you've seen the windstorms and some of the pictures that they have in papers south when you have a hurricane, and how the mobile homes just explode, kind of, well, that's exactly what the railroad cars did when they weren't made to be tipped over.
This is another accident in Champlain. Again, I don't know anything about it. It's a picture I got a hold of.
Obviously, it's behind the station.
Yes.
This is the station right here, and right where my pen would be here would be about where Butternut Street would be. And then the Savoy would be right down here. So this is across from where Mr. Agor would live, right over across the road from that nearly. And this is the field heading north. Another wreck.
Yeah. So now we're up to the lake.
In Rouses Point.
In Rouses Point with no bridge. The Vermont and Canada.
That's right. Remember, there's no bridge yet in Rouses Point, and I guess I'd have to ask Peg, let them out of turn here, how do you get that merchandise from Rouses Point to Boston if there's no bridge?
Well, you get it across by boat.
All right. They got across by boat.
I'll show you some
ferries.
The Vermont and Canada Railroad had got as far as the shore on the Vermont side with their railroad. So when they started talking bridge, they decided they would be the first ones to get a bridge across. So they started the bridge. They did up to the draw and the draw. And then the ONLC built from Rouses Point shore to the draw. So it was two railroads involved in building that. Now, the first, we say a draw, the draw bridge, in 1851, it was a barge. It was not really a bridge. It was, some called it a floating bridge, but it was really a barge, and it was 301 feet long, and it was 30 feet wide. And rails were attached to the deck of this bridge. And it ran by steam. They could turn it out of the way, and it only took 3 or 4 minutes. They could turn that sideways, and the boats could go through the channel. There was elevated aprons on the tracks that when the bridge was turned back for a train, these elevated aprons would line up the track again for a train to cross over. It was considered, you could say, the 7 wonders of the world. Well, a lot of historians call that the 8th wonder of the world, because it was such a complicated...
What you're talking about here, as an example, this is a causeway that was being built out from the state of Vermont, and here this was coming out from Rouses Point, and there was a gap in the middle so the boats could go by.
Yeah.
And instead of building a bridge, which they weren't doing at that time, they had a floating barge.
Yes.
Like this, that was situated in between, and then when a boat came, they could just turn this around and let your boats go up and down the water, and then come back. And remember, there were tracks across this, and When the train got on there, Peg, and didn't it sink down and then have a...
This is why you had elevated aprons.
Okay.
They worked with the heights of the barge, so to line it up so the engines could get off again.
Okay, that was before. Do you know whether that was in a relative position where the railroad bridge later came? Was it somewhere in that same area?
The same.
Exactly the same.
Exactly
Okay.
the same, because the causeways were never moved, only the center was changed.
All right. Okay.
So this, as I said, was run by steam, a steam winch, and they had chains and blocks, and it was a complicated thing, but within 3 or 4 minutes, they could turn that whole span, that whole barge.
That's it?
Yeah, they could turn that so boats could go from either direction.
And you want to make sure that you put it back when the trains came.
Well, it was locked in. After it was lined up again, it was locked, so there was no chance that it could. But the barge itself cost $20,000 to build, and the whole bridge, the 2 causeways and the drawbridge, was $60,000. So, and that lasted until 1868. That bridge also at that time was listed as the longest railroad bridge on the continent. It was 5,290 feet long, had 36 piers and 7,000 piles. So it was quite a feat. You can imagine that, to build something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the first train that went over that, there was several cars of butter that went over that train.
We'll take a break here. We've got someone who wants to come into the room, and we'll be right back to you. I guess I should have told you earlier that we are in the meeting room at the town garage here on Route 9, just south of the village of Rouses Point, where the town, first we get the town historian, and it's a great spot to meet. We've been here about 3 times now, Peg, the 2 hotels, and again today we have a couple ladies off to the side working on some books, and we had another lady just wanted to come in and get something else, and that was the reason for our quote-unquote interruption. Of course, it was not an interruption. It gave us a chance to take a short break, although we didn't leave our chairs. Go ahead, Peg, back to the railroad.
All right. The first trains that went over the bridge were carloads of butter. And, of course, they were noted again. The Augsburg yards designed the first refrigerator car. They took a boxcar and they built another boxcar inside of it. And then they filled in between with sawdust. And the one train went over with 8 tons of butter. It left Augsburg on Monday morning, and it was in Boston at noon on Wednesday with 8 tons of butter. And so to us, again, that was the butter train. Every Monday, the butter train went across. And the farmers had always sold their butter locally, but by sending that one load of butter, after everything was paid, the farmers cleared $800. To be divided, of course, but they were $800 more profit than selling it locally. So, of course, that caught on real well, and the butter train stayed for a long time.
You got to remember, back in the 1800s, $800 was an awful lot of money.
That's it.
Not the $800 that you're thinking of today. And just a little bit sideline here on this sawdust and what sawdust can do. It's an insulation, and many of you out there will remember that back in the 30s and the 40s, farmers were keeping, they had ice all year long, and they would put ice in a milk tank and put their cans of milk in it, and they had ice water, like a soft drink with ice in it. And you kept your ice in an ice house, which is nothing more than a regular wooden building full of sawdust, and you would bury your ice, put your ice in big blocks, 2 feet square, cover it with sawdust, put more ice, and keep doing this. And that ice would last straight into August and September in that sawdust with the 85 and 90 degree weathers, and that was a great idea. Probably a farmer thought of it, Peg.
Well, it could very well be. If we could get back to you and your ice houses, my father cut the ice from the ponds. He'd leave the house at 3 o'clock in the morning and go out on the lake. And
3 o'clock?
3 o'clock in the morning. And he'd cut the ice pond. Now, you've seen them probably, someone has, the big ice saws. He would cut these blocks you speak of. He'd get a pond, he'd mark it off, and he'd cut all these blocks. And then when the men came to work at 8 o'clock, they'd use pike poles, and they'd pull these blocks out, and they'd have a run that would go up on the truck, and they'd hoist these up on there. Harold Laundry is still around. He can tell you about that, too. They would put the ice on these trucks, take them to the ice houses. The railroad had their own ice houses for their diners. And they would put, as you say, a layer of ice with sawdust all around it, then another layer of ice, and they would build it up. And then they would keep pulling the ice from the bottom. And all the stores, Joe Laundry, a lot of the places had their own private ice houses that they did this. But my father would cut the pond, and then he would deliver the ice to the houses. He had a scale on the back of the truck, and you'd tell him you wanted 30 pounds or whatever. He would cut it, brush off the sawdust, wash it, carry it in with ice tongs, put it in the top of your ice box. And he did that for Harry Murilli and Bill Mumley. He worked for both of those icemen.
I'm sure you've seen ice tongs, you know, that you grab, you pick up.
Yeah.
They aren't just something to have. They were used, and people sold ice, delivered ice, just like you delivered milk for a while. And that's what you had to put in your ice box.
Yes.
And then the ice was on top, and the ice was on top of the
underneath to catch the water.
To catch the water that dripped out. We got off railroads there, but we're talking again what's happened in the past, and we're talking to our historian who knows all these things.
Was cutting that ice dangerous since you're always at the edge of the ice?
No, it wasn't, because it wasn't dangerous. You started at the center of the pond, and you cut your first 4 blocks, and you backed up and cut 4 more. You were never standing on the cut ice.
You could have fallen in, I guess. But
after you cut your maybe 4 or 5 rows of squares, then that was a whole pond. It was only made a certain size, maybe 4 squares wide, 4 squares long, so that the pike poles could reach the squares that were cut that were in the middle as they got to it. And then he'd go and he'd cut another pond a little ways further. But he never stood on the squares of ice. You cut ahead of you so that you were always on the solid ice of the lake.
the Clinton County Museum in Plattsburgh had an excellent show on ice.
Yes.
About a year and a half ago.
I loaned them some pictures.
There were some good pictures on that, and there are a couple of videos out that showed this museum, and they're available by checking with our local libraries. I think maybe in Rouses Point and Champlain. They can get a video for you, no charge, from the Plattsburgh Library that you could watch and see some of this ice.
Sheldon Polson's book that did that display. I don't have the book.
But
it's in there.
In here?
Yes, you can still buy it. It's ice making on Lake Champlain, and it's a very interesting book, and there's pictures in there. I acquired a picture through a postcard dealer, and I got the card, and it was the ice in Rouses Point, and my father was in the picture. So that was really an interesting card to get a hold of.
Right. Again, I'm sure in Plattsburgh you can get these in one of the bookstores, but it's Sheldon I. Posen. You hear the ice talking, the ways of people and ice on Lake Champlain, 1986. 62 pages, illustrated, $10. Another
it's a very good
occupation
book, too.
is gone, right?
Yeah.
It's gone now, no longer.
He did a great job. He came to my house several times, and I filled him in on what I knew and my father knew. And he went to Paul Swignor's, and Paul loaned him a lot of ice tongs and ice saws and everything. So everything is in his book, which is all local things. It's very good.
And there's a library in Moores and Shazy.
I beg your pardon, library in Moores and Shazy too, I'm sure. There is a list of all of the, there's maybe 200 or 300 videos available you can borrow, no charge. And Shazy, Moores, and Champlain and Rouses Point. Kind of forget you people in Shazy and Moores, didn't mean to do that, but we're talking railroads this morning, and we got off onto sawdust and ice, but that's all part of the history of this romance of railroads, and we're continue to hear no more from Peg Barcomb.
That shows it's not rehearsed. Whatever we think of, we tell you. All right, so we're back to the railroad. As I said, 1868, the first span come out, and this is when it was this wooden barge, when they took that out, and when they took that wooden barge out, it was just, the wood was in the water, and it drifted to shore, and as it drifted to shore, anybody that wanted it went down to the edge of the lake and picked it up. And this is some horses pulling some of the wood from the water. That's a picture Marion Bernard gave me, a postcard, and I had it blown up.
And this is on Montgomery Street?
That's on Montgomery Street. That's just just east of the state dock. between that and the Sportsman's Pier.
And just about where Delagar's entrance is.
Yes, you see,
Right.
it was a good spot. The current, the wood would come right in between those two places, and everybody'd go down there and get their winter's wood.
You got to remember that train went out just near where Sportsman's Dock is, right? That was right along the side. That's where the causeway was built, going across the river, the lake rather.
It's the other side of
On the other
Sportsman's
side, yeah,
Pier.
just north of
Yes,
Sportsman's Pier.
Yes, yes, all right. So this is 4 pictures of the second drawbridge that was out there. The first one was the barge. This is the second one. Now that tower in the third picture is 45 feet tall, and the two side spans are 90 feet each.
You'll notice that's all made out of wood, except for the rails, of course, go across the middle on the item, but it's great big 8x8s or 10x10s.
So a lot of work must have went into that, and
Yes.
a lot of planning to build a structure like that.
And you see all of the guy wires that came down that helped to hold this, give it strength, hold the ends up.
And this other one that you've got,
And this last picture is right here, shows it from, as you look up the tracks, this would be the Rouses Point side here, and it's heading toward Vermont, and you can see that there's the 4 rails,
Yes.
not 2, and they did not have trains that had 4, two wheels on each side. Peg will explain why they have those, but here you can see that it's open to let a boat go by, a boat, a ship, a barge, whatever. And there were a lot of barges up and down that lake, right?
lots of tugs.
Tugs that went up and down in pulling merchandise. The original bridge.
The reason for the double rail, there was 2 railroads involved. As I said, 2 built the causeway, and they each had their own rails, and one didn't touch the other one's rails. If a rail broke, depending on which railroads that rail belonged to, they were the ones that fixed it, and they each kept up their own. The drawbridge was, the expenses were shared by the railroads, but the tracks on the causeways were individually owned, and you couldn't pass 2 trains at once. But that was the reason for the double rail. They
Yeah.
each owned their own rail.
And they didn't want to build it wide enough to have
No.
one here, one there, so they actually built, one is not inside the other. In other words, this track on the outside here goes with the inside one here, and the inside here goes with that outside one there.
Yeah.
They're precise, they must be exactly the right width. Very interesting, I've never seen this type of thing before. I'd heard of this, but never saw a picture.
And the first train that crossed that new span was March 31st, 1868. So then the Northern went bankrupt, that railroad. So on January 1st, 1858, it was the Augsburg. I've been telling you things past this, but it turned into the Augsburg in 1858. So it was the same line, but it was the Augsburg. It was still really the Northern, but after they went bankrupt, they used the same lines, and some of the things were still used by the Northern name, but it was that. Then the Augsburg became the Augsburg and Lake Champlain on June 10th, 1864. So again, it's the same rails again, but instead of the Augsburg, it's the ONLC. That again was it wasn't a bankruptcy deal. It was a way to, if you reorganize, you change the name, even if you just turn it around, you get a lot of tax breaks. So they changed it into the ONLC.
That hasn't changed over the years. Everybody wants to get tax breaks.
It's still the same. Any business is still the same. All you have to do is change the name a little bit.
The government helped the railroads a lot back
Yeah,
then, right? Way
yeah.
back, the trucks were always complaining as they came along, they didn't get that kind of break. The railroad had a lot of breaks way back.
Yeah. So in March 1866, a lot of strange-looking men were getting on and all arriving in Malone. Strangers from this area. No one could figure why, and they kept coming. And finally, they realized it was the Fenians, and they were on the move. So in mid-June of 1866, there was 2,500 Fenians at the Malone Fairgrounds. They were waiting. They were getting together as an army. The Fenians, of course, were an army. And then, when they realized what was happening, the railroad then was carrying troops, U.S. troops, to Malone. So they had some more people. The troops went, and they disbanded the whole thing, so it never amounted to anything. So they dispersed them right there. But the Fenians had rode the rails, and
I've never heard of that.
That is in your Rutland book. You haven't read your Rutland book?
No, I haven't read it. I looked at pictures. I'm great at looking at pictures.
So then, now the ONLC became the Vermont Central, March 1st, 1870. Now, not Central Vermont, Vermont Central. And in the year 1870, 7,000 vessels on the lake went through that draw on Lake Champlain.
That would be north and south on the water, right?
Yes, yeah, through the draw. The draw is the body of water between the causeways.
Between the two causeways.
That's the draw.
And they called the bridge, it's called the draw bridge, right?
Because it's over the draw.
Right.
So there was 7,000 vessels went through there. Now, you think 7,000 vessels, all carrying, many tows behind them, sometimes in double width that they would have of tows going down the lake, pulled by the tugs. That was a lot of vessels.
Yeah. You're talking an average of 20 a day, if you include January and February when they weren't going up and down.
No.
So you can imagine there were 30 and 40 of these tugs, and there's a tug boat, right?
Now this is one of the tugs. This one was in Rouses Point very, very often. I remember that. But look at that beautiful eagle on the top. See, these tugs were privately owned, and they would haul the barges loaded with whatever was going down the river or down the lake. And it's just like the railroad. The railroad owned the engine, but they don't own what's in the cars. Well, this here, they owned their tug, and they just delivered the merchandise. The eel boat used to be one that we used to watch quite often. This boat would come up from New York, and it would go through to Canada once a year. And it'd be up high in the water when it went down. But when it came back, it would be very low, and that would be filled with eels. And it would go to New York for the fancy restaurants. They served eel. But to us, that was the eel boat.
Yeah.
And then all the barges that the barges that were on the tugs that carried paper, there was so much paper that went up and down. That was the big thing during my time. It was the paper that was brought in. And to us, those were the paper boats.
Still is a lot of paper coming down on the trains.
Yeah.
That's one of their main commodities. As a matter of fact, when we did our show with in Plattsburgh on the recycling, they have projected about 40%, more than anything else, about 40 to 42% of all of the refuse going into a landfill is paper, one kind of another. Paper's a big commodity.
Yeah.
And while we're talking about paper, and before we get into some more pictures, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back to you. Thanks much for watching Hometown Cable every night, and particularly on Sunday nights, and this special show, a mini-series with you for 3 or 4 nights on the railroading in the Northern Tier. I'm Bob Ben. This is Peg Barcomb, the smiling lady on my right. While we were taking our break, we started talking about the Fenians that Peg mentioned. As I'm looking here, first I want to show you a picture of Jonas Wilder. He's the man that invented that refrigeration car, and he had 8 of them built to his specification. Now Wilder is very interested in the, I'm wondering if they can do with that Wilder that wrote the stories over there in Malone. But anyway, in this book it mentions the Fenian, F-E-N-I-A-N Society, what Peg talked about, was an outgrowth of the Irish Revolutionary Brotherhood. This is in that book on the Rutland Railroad. And they had established for 2 decades with the avowed purpose of freeing Ireland from British domination. And they were intending to go up into Canada. That's what they were raiding. There was a raid up into just across the border. They went up and they were turned back by the Canadians. And then, as she mentioned, the army was sent up here. And so if you want to know more about the Fenians, there's about 1.5 pages of this. And there are other books, F-E-N-I-A-N-S. All right?
And they also were the ones that
Oh, yes.
the raid in
They
St. Albans.
they also were involved with that raid that they had in 1862 or 3 in the city of St. Albans, Vermont. That became so well known, and the stories on that. And there was a movie called The Raid about that, and that was the Fenians, Fenians. And Peg just got something else to look forward to seeing in the library. Go ahead, Peg.
All right, back to I told you in 1870 there was 7,000 vessels that went through the draw. Well, that same year, across the bridge on the rails, there was 60,000 railroad cars that crossed the bridge, carrying 26,000 passengers and 148,000 ton of freight. And this is all in 1870. So you see the lake plus the railroad were pretty busy.
Right. Remember, then there was no way you could cross the railroad, cross the lake rather, other than by boat or ferry, or walk the tracks. Right? I guess you could walk the tracks, but.
And before the bridge, there was the railroads owned boats much bigger than this. They owned boats, and they carried freight across, and then it would get on the Vermont side, or vice versa, and the freight would be put back on the trains. But this is a ferry boat, and this ferry boat carried horses and freight and passengers and anything that could fit on it. They carried across on that boat, and the oarsman, the man at the end with the guiding it, is my uncle.
Oh, we got to see that.
This boat was the Yankee Bob.
I was just going to comment about that. This is the Yankee Bob.
Yeah, and but he was the rudder man, not the oarsman, the rudder man. But we had several ferries in Rouses Point over different times before there was a bridge, but this is one of the ones that carried more of the freight than.
Her uncle was the rudder man, and her father was the udder man.
The udder man, the ice man. Well, and an interesting idea too, when the train and the boat were getting to that bridge at the same time, the boats had the rights over the trains. Trains had to stop and let the boats go through first. It was hard to stop a train, but it was still harder to stop a boat. So the boats always had the rights over. And the record length train that went over that second drawbridge was 90 car freight. And today there's 100 and think nothing of it.
Yeah.
90 car was a record. But as I say, the railroads had their own boats, and they had one built, the Oaks. There's another name to it. Oaks is half of the name. Built for the railroad in Shelburne, Vermont. It cost $36,000, but that was a real huge one. It could carry a lot of freight. So then I told you at the starting of our story that the Northern built their first railroad station out on the pier. Well, this is it. This is what is today the Sportsman's Pier. To me, that was the depot dock.
All right, now there's a boat here, right, on this side, which is the southern side, I take it, right, where the boat is. And this has boggled my mind to realize that a building that big was out there on Sportsman's pier, on that pier, and rooms, everything else in that regular hotel.
That was built in 1852. It was 100 feet long, and it was 100 feet wide. And the trains went right in underneath, went around to the roof. They went in there. And on the second floor was where people slept. That's not a good picture because it's very old and it's a newspaper, but it's the best I could get. And the people slept upstairs. Then down at the south end was the station and the restaurant. Now you can see the front of it better in this picture. This is a picture that was drawn by a man named Kilburn for Ballou's magazine in 1857. And you can see it was called Steamboat. Was it Steamboat? Yeah, Steamboat Hotel. The sign is over the top of the hotel.
Okay, our pictures have been repositioned a little bit, and Peg's talking about our hotel called what?
Steamboat Hotel. And this man Kilburn drew this from the railroad bridge, and it shows good the front of that hotel, which is where the station and the restaurant was. But it didn't go over good because there was, between the smell and the noise and everything, it wasn't used very much. So after a while, there was a tornado that went through, and the tornado took off part of the roof, so when it did, they just tore the rest of it down and abandoned it. That was the end of the station.
Show where the St. Patrick's Church is in that picture, Bob.
Oh, okay. To look, what you're looking at right over here, right at the end of my pen, right there is the St. Patrick's Church. So you're looking at it from the northeast. There's the church, and the community is located in here, and this is where the pier comes out. And as it shows one of the boats coming in. Our setup for our pictures is not the best. There's been a little bit of glare, but we want to remind you that our picture holders here come to you the courtesy of our councilman. Here is one right here, and I just flipped their name right out, see? And I had myself 3 picture holders. And we want to thank them for that.
Now this is they called them the Black Gang. This is the men that coaled the tugs. The railroad would put the piles of coals down on the end of Sportsman's Pier, and then when the boats come in, these men they'd put a platform across, and they'd use wheelbarrows, and they would fill the hold of the tug, or whichever boat it happened to be, with the coal. So they called them the Black Gang. They weren't black, but they always had coal soot on them, so they were referred to as the Black Gang.
See the shovel. Now remember, for you people who are familiar with coal, what we call pea coal, little tiny, the size of maybe an inch or a half-inch diameter, this coal was soft coal in most cases, and you had hunks of coal that were the size of a baseball or a softball and other pieces. So this was not little tiny proportionate coal pieces like you would think of, or like crushed stones. It's not like that at all. They were big pieces.
They were coal scoops.
Coal scoops that they had. And here they are here, big shovels, the scoops, and then they had the one-piece wooden handle, which is an antique today. You see them once in a while at a garage sale or at an auction. Big shovels. They worked very hard. It was a very hard job.
So the next we went on, and we're done with the wooden drawbridge now and the Sportsman's. So they took out that wooden drawbridge that you saw before, and they put up the steel one in 1900. So again, they sold the wooden drawbridge to William Seguin today. We always called it the French name when we were younger, and it was Saint. But he bought that, so it was in the water. So on the 4th of July, he put 5 pounds of dynamite under it and blew it up. And a lot of it came to shore. And that picture shows some of it on the shore where they were getting ready to pick it out of the water. But that's remnants of the wooden drawbridge.
Again, this is the location of today's Montgomery Street. It comes right around, and Bill Nautel's house would be right here. This is the base of State Street, really.
Yes.
State Street starts just above, and this is that area where the entrance into Delagard.
And that house in that picture, most of you know of and have heard of Mike Finnegan in Plattsburgh. It's in all the...
Yes.
The volunteer all the time. Well, his grandparents lived in the front of that house, and my parents lived in the back. It was a double tenement.
Mike Finnegan was the Irishman of the Year, right?
Yes,
He does an awful lot of work at the hospital, takes a lot of pictures.
He always
very,
does.
very well. Donates a lot of his time.
Well, his grandparents lived in that house. They lived in the front, and we lived in the back. And that was right in front of the state dock. It's where that house was. And notice the round barn in that picture.
Yes, that's... would be right about behind, across Mankill's restaurant, but on the other side of the water.
Up a little further.
A little further than that.
Yeah, where, who was in there? The hairdresser. I can't think of the name of it. Unisex, maybe? The hairdresser.
Oh, okay, so you're talking
next
nearly
to the
behind where Kathy's
drugstore.
is now in the area.
Yeah, right along in that area is
yeah,
where that
round
was.
Barn, right. Was that a place for boats, do you know? It was the boat storage.
But the boats went right in there. And then just to be, they were still in the water, and they'd bring them right up in there and store them.
Very interesting.
But that was an interesting, but you see there used to be a street there, behind all those buildings, behind Pearls and all that, there was a street.
That ran parallel with Lake Street.
Yeah, and it went right over between the state dock and Bill, as you say, Bill Nautel's. It went right along behind Bill Nautel's and down behind Pearls and all, and people that bought their coal or their wood went down in the back of the stores to pick up their supplies.
Unbelievable. I never realized
was a
that.
street
Never
down there.
realized that, Peg.
Yeah.
There's a wooden sidewalk. You can see this is a sidewalk, but it's made out of wood.
We got some better pictures
Have you?
of,
Okay.
of the sidewalk.
We'll see that wooden sidewalk a little bit later then.
Yeah. So then this is a picture of the Rouses Point station after they went out with the steam house one out on the pier. This is the one that was built, 1866.
Remember, that's not Pratt Street.
No, that's just north of the fire station.
And further away
The
from
road that goes down to the fire, there's a road that goes behind the fire station. Well, that road was there when that station was there. It wasn't tarmac like today. Then the station was about 6 feet from the edge of that road. We were talking about this yesterday with Calvin, trying to place it for him. And when I went home, I went down that way, and there's Bayshore has some storage tanks on the ground, 275-gallon storage tanks. Well, right where those tanks are setting is where that station was. So if you try to pinpoint it, it's right there. But it would be just north of the fire station. And
Yep.
then the tracks were just the other side of that. And Calvin pinpointed that by saying, well, where the beer tent is for the 4th of July doings, that's where the railroad tracks were.
Okay. We're talking here only east-west tracks at this time.
Yes.
We're still talking east-west. There's no north and south in Rouses Point. There is by 1900, but there wasn't in the 1870s.
No. So in 1858, there was a big machine shop in the area of that station, and it moved to Malone. Later we'll show you on a blueprint where those machine shops were. They had, when they moved, it took 300 people out of Rouses Point all at once. There were families, and I was counting the children, the wives, and so on, but 300 people all at once left Rouses Point, which made a real big dent in the economy here. It picked up again, but they all followed because it was a job, and a good job, working for the railroad. And of course the big shops that were made in Malone were big enough that they didn't need this one down here, so they moved everything into Malone.
You're talking many hundreds of people that were
Yes.
dedicated to that railroad,
Yes,
weren't you? That's just
yes.
that portion that left,
Yeah.
300.
Yeah. And
Today there's 15 to 20 in railroading in the village of Rouses Point, give or take 1 or 2.
And those people that worked in those machine shops all had like huts, not real homes. They were poor people, and these were jobs, and they just built what they could and got into them. And of course, in that time, there was this uptown, downtown thing. Rouses Point started uptown, around the area of the Saxony. That was the start of the village. But when the railroad come in, they were downtown. Where they come in, the uptown people didn't want anything down there, so they stayed uptown until the railroad got there. Well, when the railroad got there, they had to have some identification, so Hoyle from Champlain, who I mentioned before, George Hoyle, was head of the railroad, was superintendent, then he became president of the railroad, and they named it Hoyleton. Now, we talked about Hoyleton when we did the tape on the Saxony. Well, then they got in a fight over the post office because they each had a post office. In 1851-52, there was 2 post offices actually in Rouses Point. One was uptown, one was downtown. So uptown wanted to keep it up there. The government said you only can have one. So they wanted to keep it up there, and Hoyleton wanted to keep it downtown. So down in the courthouse, it's interesting. You can read all the whole court case of what developed over this as to how it went. And each of the postmasters wrote to the government and gave their side as to why they should keep the post office, and included a few little fibs along the way. But anyway, they decided there would be one post office. The government decided there would be one post office. It would be called Rouses Point, and it would be downtown because of the railroad. So the uptown people had to come downtown to get their mail. But even today, we talk about uptown and downtown, and we still do it. I mean, after all these years, it's still just, our generation still calls it that, uptown and downtown. So, but anyway, Rouses Point got the post office, but we had Hoyleton only 1 year. And anyone that would have been lucky enough to get a Hoyleton postmark, it's I checked at different places, and one in Massachusetts, a big stamp dealer, he said if you ever found one, it'd cost about $250 if you could find it. But Hugh McClellan had some, and he always told, not Hugh, Woody McClellan. He always told me that he was going to get in the vault one day and he was going to give me one to keep for, you know, the history. But he never did get in there and get it. So, but I know there was some because he had some. So
We're going to give you a minute to go look and see if you can find one of those stamps in your records at your house, and we'll be right back to you. You're watching Bob Then with Peg Barcomb, the historian, and we hope you're enjoying railroading in the Northern Tier. While we were having our break here, well, you didn't know we were having a break, except I told you we were talking to two ladies who are also in the room with us, and we were mentioning VCRs, and one of them mentioned she doesn't have a VCR. And I said, you ought to have one so you could record things like this and watch it again. And Peg said, she said, well, I don't like to rent movies. And Peg, what did you tell us? Tell us what you said.
I said I went to Barcomb's 2 years ago and I bought a VCR just to get Channel 21. And that's the truth. I've never rented a movie. I'm not one that really likes movies. I have enough history stuff and letters to write and things that I don't get into a lot of it. But I bought a VCR just so I could watch Channel 21, and that's a plug for them, but it's the truth.
And it's long before that she knew she was going to be on with Bob Then, watching herself too.
Yeah.
But she can watch herself now, and she's keeping them as a record, right?
Watch. Well, I think the first things I started watching was like the Chamber of Commerce Winter Carnival dinners and things, and that got me interested. Here's all these local people. And then I watched St. Patrick's Choir, and that did it. I had to go buy one.
And you've got the Routes celebration.
Oh, yes.
Your many hours of work and a lot of other people's work.
Looking at that over so many times. But, oh yes, I love my VCR. No.
All right. And this one will be on it too.
All right, so we're back to 1883. And in 1883, 5 railroads came into Rouses Point. So now you're thinking, today we're lucky if we've got one CN train every 2 or 3 days maybe, and we got this one little lonely passenger train, and hardly, I still love to listen to trains, and I hear them go by my house, and there's hardly anything to hear anymore. And when you think 5 railroads came into Rouses Point. Now I'll give you some names. Some of these, as I say, used the same tracks, but they were different names. Sometimes they were called the same because they were only leased. So the names is going to sound, some are going to sound odd to you, but this is why. We started out with the Northern, turned to the O&LC, then it became the Vermont Central, then it came the Central Vermont, then it was the Rutland, and it stayed Rutland until Rutland went out. But we also had Plattsburgh and Montreal, which turned to Montreal and Plattsburgh. We had La Prairie, St. John's, Lake Champlain and St. Lawrence, Canada and Atlantic, Grand Trunk, Naperville Junction, Canadian National, and Delaware and Hudson. So now there's the names at one time or another in Rouses Point. There was somebody working for that railroad in a Rouses Point station.
It certainly was a hub, right, of this whole northeast up here.
One historian a while back, I think it was Reverend Taylor, made the remark that if you were in Rouses Point, you could go to anywhere from Rouses Point because there was roads going in the whole 4 directions. So it was really a bustling town, but at one time there was 20 passenger trains a day in and out of Rouses Point. So
you're talking 2 of the largest cities, New York and Montreal, and you're also the east-west traffic going into New England, right, from New York.
Yeah. So the station, I showed you a small picture, but here's a real interesting picture. Now this is the station in Rouses Point, and I told you it was built in 1866, and it was built by the O&LC. Before I tell you more about the station, the O&LC also built a block for 8 apartments, and it was right where Rouses Point Grand Union is today. Now the railroad built that for their officials, and their officials lived in that house. It was tore down only when they were going to build the Grand Union there. When the railroad went out, the O&LC went out, it was rented out as apartments to private people. But that was in there. So now in this, notice the water tank. That water tank was the O&LC water tank. In 1901, the village told the railroad they either had to move it back because Lake Street went right between the railroad station and the water tank. going towards Rose Avenue if you're going north.
Now, as much as this looks like Pratt Street and the D&H Railroad Station as you know it today, you remember this is not that location.
No.
You got to remember.
It's down on Lower
The
Lake.
lake is over here. This is west. That's the east. There's the tower, and right between the tower and this building is Lake Street going north to Canada. It crosses it over.
Now that water tank, as I said, the village told them they either had to move it back because it was too close to Lake Street in case it burst or something, or take it down. And they were not using it anymore, so they did take it down. Now, in the background also, you'll see a sign that says Saucony, some big tanks. Now, I don't know how well you can see them, but this is right where Delagar's is today. There was 5 big storage tanks there, just like they have at the entrance of Plattsburgh. It belonged to the Standard Oil Company. Now, some of the people that worked there that I remember was George Thomas and Clarence St. John's and Sterling Bennett. They were all men that worked there. And when they loaded these tanks, when they filled these tanks, a barge would come down the lake and would park at so-called today Sportsman's Pier, and there was pipes, 4-inch pipe, iron pipe, up about 2.5, 3 feet off the ground, and they came down the length of the pier and down Montgomery Street and over into that area. They were buried under the road of Montgomery Street, and then they went up to this tank. And George Thomas, I can remember it as if it was yesterday. We lived, as I say, right by the state dock, and this was right next to us. He would get up on the top of those tanks, and some days he'd be up there and it'd be pouring rain. He'd be kicking his feet on the side of the empty tanks and singing to the top of his lungs. And he had to stay up there until it filled, because that was the way they knew when it was full. It was pumped direct into the tank, so somebody had to be on top of there when it was full to shut it off.
You could tell by the sound, maybe, too.
Well, he'd sit there and he'd kick his heels and he'd sing, but that was there for many, many years. And then that property was empty, and then until Smith took it over. But that was pumped direct in there.
Here's some milk cans that we talked before for milk for the farmers. These are milk cans waiting to be loaded, I would assume loaded on, or were discharged. Coming back empty, I'm not sure which, right here. And there's your tracks that went east and west.
So then now, like your railroad mail car, again, we had our milk trains and we had the mail car and the baggage car and all on each of the trains. Well, on the rail mail car, for 1 month, February 17th to March 17th in 1885, this is the mail. This is the receipt for the mail. The D&H received 5,360 pounds of mail, and they sent out 3,813 pounds. Now this is just
their
D&H.
own mail. Their own.
This is post office mail, not D&H mail. Post
Right.
office mail.
Okay.
It was brought from the post office in big bags, and it was brought to the railroad, and the railroad put it up in the mail car. Then the Vermont Central had received 1,291 pounds, and they sent out 3,688 pounds. The Grand Trunk received 1,043 pounds and sent out 925 pounds. Now that was a bit over 8 tons of mail in 1 month that they handled on the railroad. And that's not counting the CV. The CV they didn't have records for the CV when they put this article in the newspaper, so they only covered those few trains.
What would bring all that mail to Rouses Point? Where would that all? I mean, there was no heiress. You had no.
Well, it didn't necessarily come to Rouses Point to stay in Rouses Point.
Oh, all right.
See,
okay.
they handled this much mail.
It. Okay, some came across from Vermont. Could be different ways.
Yes,
okay.
all the different ways. This is how much mail those railroads handled in that 1 month.
Okay.
In 1896, the CV, which we haven't mentioned that yet, that's a newer railroad. When we got to the CV in 1896, they moved 1,090,000 ton of freight in 1896, and they had 34 locomotives. So it wasn't a tiny railroad. Now this is when the railroads changed hands. The Northern was 1850 to 1858, which was the first one. Then the Augsburg Railroad was 1858 to 1864. The ONLC was 1864 to 1870. The Vermont Central was 1870 to 1886. The CV 1886 to 1896, and the Rutland 1901 to 1962.
That's the first one in any length of time, 16 years or so.
So that's that's the age of the roads. And as I say, we say Vermont Central and we say Central Vermont, but they were all, you know, in this area, and some, as I say, leased. So you use the same name. So it's a kind of a complicated, if you wanted to get right to find out which railroad it was, well, it's all in the books.
But since 1962 when the Rutland disbanded and left, all the tracks have been picked up. The metal has been picked up. It's gone. Just the right-of-ways have been sold to other people, right?
Yeah. Now that was about the peak of the trains. That whole mess of stuff going across the bridge and this much mail and all. That was about the peak of railroading. In 1886, too, to go to the Malone Fair, the trains used to be very good for the people that lived along the route. The railroad companies were always trying to do things for them. So for the 4th of July celebration in Malone in 1886, they cut all the fares to half price. Any railroad, any train that came into Malone, the prices were half fare. So everybody could bring their kids and their aunts and uncles and everybody, so they all went to Malone Fair at half price on the railroad. It was something that I suppose because there wasn't cars and things, it was really a big boost, and it made people like the railroad because a lot didn't want it to come in the first place. They didn't think it was a good deal, so that's what they did. Now this is 3 postcards. It's just different pictures along the route of the railroad.
That's Norwood, Malone, and the third one is Moores Forks, New York. Norwood, and as I was thinking here, Norwood got famous within the past 10 years or so. Their firemen's band went to the Olympics in Europe. They were an outstanding small marching band, I guess. The men mostly were in the fire department, and they went to which is quite an accomplishment, and they got some notoriety on that. And then this is Malone, New York. Malone Junction, which is a little bit different. That's out on Elm Street as you would head north from the center of the community. And then Ellenberg, Moores Forks rather, and that was a great big building, and obviously that's not a station, that probably is a milk...
Either the milk shed or a freight shed.
Okay, big building there.
Yeah. So another kind of interesting thing that I don't think many Rouses Pointers remember, we don't have too many of our old-timers left, Georgiana Burnham, who everybody knew in Rouses Point, used to clean the railroad coaches. They'd put a coach on a siding, and that was her job. When they'd come in, they'd let her know, and she'd go down, and they'd send a call boy up, and she'd come down, and she'd clean the coaches and get them ready for their next trip. So that, you know, that was quite a job for a woman to be doing. But
now Burnham, that name sounds familiar. Did she live on Maple Street at the head of White Avenue, that little white building that's just been renovated?
Yeah.
We were going by there the other day, and I was mentioning to Calvin it hadn't been rented yet, but we noticed that it's there, and completely renovated.
That was her home.
She's recently passed away, didn't she?
Yes. But that was where she lived. But that's what she did. She cleaned the railroad coaches. And so you've already seen the pictures of the railroad station. Now this is what turned into the station, but it actually was made for the immigration office. On the Rutland.
Before this picture was taken before that other one we saw?
No, this is after the big brick station was taken down.
Okay.
Then the railroad was nearly completely gone, so they used this little middle building for a railroad station. But that building was the immigration office. If the officers took someone off the train and had to hold them till the next train, they were kept in that building. There was bars on the doors, almost like a jail, but it wasn't really. Mm-hmm. There was beds if they had to stay overnight. There was 2 bunks in 2 rooms. There was a sink. There was a little office affair-like. And then in the back of that building was the boiler room, steam boiler. And then the building you see way in the back is the Rutland Freight Office. Now, the back end of it was the freight shed, but it was all one building. One end of it was the freight office, the back was the freight shed. Now, when I talked about Georgiana Burnham, well, my mother used to mop the floors. The Rutland station, that big brick station, that took us a long time. I used to go with her. I was maybe a young teenager, and we'd mop that station. We'd go over to this immigration office in the back and get boiling water out of from the boiler, and then we'd have a mop and a pail and a wringer, and the two of us would clean that station, that big station, the floor in there. Then this so-called immigration office, we did that. She had that too, and the freight office, the whole store there, the whole business. In the immigration office, I don't know anybody I can't remember who worked there. But the freight office, Warren Smith and Gene Strong, I distinctly remember. There's some others, but I can't think who they were. I was too young to, those two, I always remembered them two names, but the others didn't know. They were in there, and they used to have great big high stools, and their desks were real high, like you see in the old pictures, like in Scrooge, there at his desk. Well, that's the way the desks were in that building. And the men had sat right on the stools with their feet up on the rungs, and we'd mop right under their feet. And they'd stay right there and keep right on working.
So you would mop the floor together?
Yeah.
When I used to be at home and I did something my mother didn't like, she used to mop the floor with me. But we'll take a short break while we're finishing mopping up here, and we'll be right back to you, Bob. Then, what's going on here with Peg Barcomb, our town historian? We're looking at that building, another picture here that Peg mentioned, where you and your mother...
I didn't mention
Oh, you did. Well, you mentioned that's the building you had done the work in.
The three that I showed you, the Rutland Station, the Immigration Office, and the Rutland Freight Office. Now this is the CN Freight Office, which was across the tracks.
Beg your pardon?
This one too. There was an office downstairs, which was George Brothers' office in that building. And upstairs was one huge office with lots of desks and one private office. Now I remember George Brothers had the office downstairs, Phil Dion and Bert Cameron upstairs. There was many more, but I can only remember those two. And the private office upstairs was Charles Malloy, agent from 1916 to 1936. And he's father of Paul Malloy in Rouses Point.
Now, Peg, that is the CN, that is no longer there.
No longer
Where was
there.
that physically located? Approximately?
Right at the end of Barnes Street. You'd have hit it. If you'd have kept going and didn't turn on Lily Avenue,
Okay.
you'd have hit it.
That's where we're talking now, is right at the end, right behind Shazy Hardware, just to the north of it, right?
Yeah.
That's the area.
Right in that area.
Right.
If you would have went up Barnes Street, you would have been right to it. It was right there. But this building, on the back end of that, was their freight shed. It was all attached. And George Brothers' office was downstairs, and there was a great big window in his office that you could look out into the freight shed. And I wasn't very old, and sometimes my mother would be sick or something and couldn't go. And in the winter, we brought our water in a milk can. We'd have boiling water, and we'd put it in a milk can, and we'd bring it on a sled. And we'd do these floors. We'd take it a pail at a time and bring it up the stairs and so on. And I always was afraid to go alone when we had to do George Brothers' office, because the wind would blow through there, and it was the eeriest sound you ever heard. And the shed, of course, was pitch black. And I'd rush to get through George's office so I could go upstairs.
I hope you weren't afraid of George.
I was afraid of what might have been in that freight shed. He had this huge window in his office that looked right out in there. And sometimes I learned later where the switch was, and I put the light on, leave the light on while I worked. But we brought our water from home in a milk can and on a sled, and my mother did that for years.
So there was no hot water in that building?
No hot water in that building. And in the summer, we'd get it over at the boiler on the Rutland side, but you had to cross all these 5 rows of tracks to get over to the CN.
That water must have cooled off quite a bit by the time you left home and got
No, it
to work?
didn't. No, because we lived by the state dock.
Okay.
So we just went up and around Lake Street and over to the CN. So, but my mother did that for years until they was no more need for a janitor. So she had some railroad rights too. But
So you worked for the railroad too, in a
yes.
way, didn't you?
Yeah, yeah, and
And your mother did too,
yeah,
so
that's
when
what
you
I
get right
say.
down to it, yeah.
She did. She was worked there for many years. But that was the freight shed. And another thing I remember was when the passenger trains come in, Jimmy Manette, he was a crippled man. We us women remember him. I don't know if you did. He was crippled one arm, and he used to go to meet every passenger train, and he had a basket, and he'd sell cigarettes and candy bars. He'd get right up in the train, and they'd let him get up in the train and sell cigarettes and candy bars in the train. And that's what that man did for a living, and he did good. I mean, just doing that. So we're up to a wreck now. This is the wreck out on the drawbridge.
Oh, yes.
Let's see, we'll get them all up here. Now this wreck was April 2nd, 1920. And the ice pushed the rails so that they were not aligned right. And so the train went in. The engine went in. Now the engine stayed down there 1 year. They stayed in the water 1 year.
It stayed in the water for a
Yes,
year.
1 year. 1 year. It stayed in the water.
And the boat could still go up and down all right? Didn't
Well,
bother them, huh?
Didn't bother.
Was down far
Apparently it was
enough?
down enough because it stayed there a year.
There's the opening, that would be the draw, and then here you can see the crane, and I guess that's part of a boxcar frame.
No, that's see, I can't see them from here,
What
but I'll
is
tell you
this,
what they are. That's the bottom, the trucks of the tender.
Oh, okay. And then here it shows some of the trucks being...
That's the trucks.
The trucks are the wheels underneath, they call a section of the tire, the wheels rather, the metal wheels. That
That's
whole
the
section is called
tender's
the trucks.
trucks. That's the tender's trucks.
That's the tender they're pulling out. And here's
That's the whole tender.
the whole tender being
And see,
pulled up. The tender,
this went underneath this, and then the wheels went underneath this.
right. Now the tender is the part that you carry either the wood or the coal right behind your engine.
Yes.
To tend to your engine.
Yeah.
And then the very last one's an amazing picture where you see two cranes
That's a D&H and a B&M crane.
lifting up the complete engine out of the water or it's suspended in midair.
Yeah. And on the tender, this one I think,
Yes.
you can see the big U.S.
On the side, yes.
See,
you
the
can
government took over the railroad during the First War.
So you can tell at the bottom was on the left and the top is on the right because that's the way the printing is.
And they still
It says
had some of the
US.
stenciling on the cars, so this is the big U.S.
And
is
that was
still
down
on
there for the year also, the tender
No,
and
yeah, the
both
whole
of them were
thing.
down there for a year.
Yeah. It probably was because they couldn't get the big cranes until a certain time or
Probably
whatever.
doing a wreck someplace else.
But to get those two big cranes here, see the B&M, I mean Boston, Maine,
Mm-hmm.
and the D&H, to get them there.
Do you have any recollection or anything that you ever had as to what caused that?
Yeah, the ice.
Oh, the ice.
The ice
Had undercut it?
moved the piers enough. It wedged them that the rails weren't aligned.
Yep.
So it threw it off.
Yep. Two of the biggest problems you have with trains is the ice and rains and floods. They just...
But see, whoever works the bridge has to walk, well did. Whoever was the bridge tender had to walk both ends of that bridge every time a train went by, just in case that they had threw some sparks or something and the ties might be burning. So they had to come this one end, the New York end, then they had to go back, and then they had to go to the Vermont end, just to be sure that there was, and they have discovered fires, so it was a precaution. The train didn't know that they started a fire, hot box or something start up a fire.
That's winter as well as summer out there, folks, yes.
Oh, yes.
You walk out there in that 20 below zero.
Yeah, and if the ice was moving at all, they had that in the winter. They also had to check for the ice, and if the ice was moving, they had to call St. Albans. They couldn't call ashore in Rouses Point. They couldn't call over any of the offices. They had to call St. Albans, and St. Albans would then call out men. They'd call Rouses Point, and Rouses Point would go out and send a call boy and get men to go out there, and they'd chop that ice away from the piles so that it wouldn't force the bridge. But that was something they all did too. But in them days, you see, whoever the bridge tender was, like during that wreck, the men lived on the bridge. Now this is a little girl that lived out there that still lives in Champlain. She gave me this, and I had it copied. She doesn't know I'm using it. Now her father was one man before her. Tom Gibo lived out there, and he was one of the ones I remember. And when two of his children had to go to school, he had to come off, because otherwise in the morning he had to use a boat and bring the kids to shore, and at night come and get them. So he moved off the bridge. But then these people, this is Beatrice Hilliker Ducharme. She lives in Champlain yet. Her father, Bob Hilliker, was the last bridge tender that lived out there on that bridge. And there too, when his children had to go to school, he moved back off. And then from then on, the men walked. They didn't live out there anymore. When it come their shift, they walked out on the bridge, and they used the house that was there, like to make their lunch and so on. But when their shift was done, they walked back. Nobody lived out there after the Hillikers.
I'm glad she mentioned that. She mentioned the word house, and there was a house out there. They didn't live out there on the tracks like you might like to believe. There was a house out there. There was like a spur that stuck out, a little
We got some
section.
pictures.
And one of them, I like to mention, is on the corner of Maple and Washington Avenue, a little gray house. I think the lady's name is Mrs. Sargent, is living in one that used to be out there.
That was Charlie Bro brought that on the ice. He took that down and he brought it over on the ice and put it there. And it stayed his till he died, and then till his wife died. But they always lived in that little house. But they brought that across on the ice when they took it off the draw. Now, some of the last tenders that were out there was Noah Belair and Casper Muller and my father. They were the last ones that were draw tenders out on that bridge.
Now,
my father was still there when the Rutland closed.
But he didn't live out there at any time?
No, nobody did
Okay,
after the
that.
Hillikers.
Okay, after
No,
the
they were the
Hillikers,
last
right.
ones. After that, nobody lived out there. So now, these is some of the wood structure again that was there when this last steel bridge we're talking about. This is some of the wood structure that's out at the draw. Now, some of this is still there, and some of it, they're using it for timbers, and people are just helping themselves to whatever they can get of the timbers that is still remaining. But this is what it looked like when the Rutland closed down in '62.
There's an awful lot of wood.
You could see Windmill Point good in that picture, in the background.
That's over across.
Yeah. And this one shows you the size of the timber. And look at the iron strapping, the size of that.
Okay, this is a real good close-up. Is the size of these timbers that Peg is mentioning. A lot of this probably spruce, which is good in water. And then up here is this strapping that held it to its various places. This is up and down, and this must be some cross ties here, and the track must have run in this direction. I've never seen these before either. I'm kind of guessing looking at these sideways. We hope you're enjoying watching railroading in the Northern Tier, and our expert, our professional, and our benefactor here, Peg Barcomb, a town historian, doing this for us this morning.
Now this is the turntable that turned the steel drawbridge. And this is taken from underneath the bridge. They're down underneath to take these pictures. But you can see that was a great big huge wheel made on the...
Right, and there's the little wheel that would turn around on this circular, it looks like a gear on the edge.
Yeah.
That was for strength, obviously. And this is and the bridge is up on top. And then there's some more of the wood structure. I'm sure that many of you people have never seen this type of thing, and I know I never have.
And that turns so easily. When the boat was coming, there was a ladder at the tower, and the tender had to go up the ladder. We got pictures of the tower later. He went up the ladder to the tower, and he started this generator, and he got this motor going, and that turned just as easy, even though it was a very heavy thing. It was so well built and so well balanced that there was never any problem.
Which is the magic, really. It's got to be balanced.
Yeah.
That's the...
So then there was a bad accident out there in 1905. This Frank Mott had been in Rouses Point, and he was going back to Alberg. He lived in Alberg. Well, he lived on Windmill Point. And he was going back, and a train overtook him. And when the train overtook him, it cut off both his legs and one arm. That wasn't bad enough. This was at 9 p.m. at night. So by 2 o'clock in the morning, the man was still there. And a CV passenger train had went over him. A freight train had went over him. and another engine. And when the next engine got over him, the engineer thought he heard some moans, so he backed up and backed over the poor man again.
Unbelievable.
And that man is
Unbelievable.
still living.
Unbelievable.
So he was still conscious, and he was able to tell them what had happened. And he said he tried to put his head on the rails to end it all, but he wasn't able to. And he still lived until they got him home before he died. Now, my brother-in-law is Tim Mott, and this was his great-uncle. So these Motts all...
Now, they walked across the tracks, and if a train did come, they're supposed to climb down the side, I think you told me,
You
right?
had to get on the side. That's why the ties jutted out on each side of the rails. And if a train was coming, you were to get off. But if there was a big south wind, my father's told me that many times, if there was a big wind blowing, you didn't always hear the train.
Yep.
And apparently he didn't hear the train coming up on him, and it was too late. He
And
couldn't get out.
Some of
away.
these people going back at 9 o'clock at night probably were not coming back from church, and probably didn't hear as much as you would
No,
expect.
this is it.
There may have been some drinking involved in some of these, and they were tired. They had been partying, and I've heard about this, but I didn't realize there were that many things that had touched that poor man.
And I copied that out of the newspaper article that was right in the paper at the time. And as I say, it was my brother-in-law's great uncle, so it was right the Mott family. Now this is this is at the end of the bridge, and you can see a switch there real well.
Whenever you see this item coming up, and it has this bar, we'll show you some of those later in the yard. You're talking about a switch. We saw one of these when we were at R.L. Parsons in his basement. It's a switch, and this throws two tracks that are puts you from one track to another. It's called a switch. Is that right, Peg?
Yes.
And they have a color. They're either yellow, red, whatever, meaning different things. And this is at the end of the bridge?
Yes. This is the Montgomery Street end. And if it was a Rutland train coming, they threw the switch to hit the two Rutland tracks. And if the CV was coming, they turned it to hit the CV tracks before they went out onto that bridge. That's some of the Hoig family, some of Frank Hoig's relatives. I have their names somewhere else, but I just wanted you should see the railroad switch today.
He's one of the persons I was told worked at the railroad for many years. Isn't Frank?
Yes.
Frank worked at CN.
Yeah. Now, seeing that, I'm not sure, but I think that man in that picture is Sam Turner. Helen Turner and Rouses Point's father-in-law. I'm pretty sure that's him.
Would be the person on the left.
He had a little, we called it a jitney. It was a little platform car, had just 4 little iron wheels, and every day he went down to the railroad. He had a little lean-to right near where that is, and he'd get that little car out, and he would go over to Alberg, check the rails the whole length, and he would come back, and he did that every day. That was to watch for the rails and all. Even though the men watched for fires, he watched for anything wrong with the rails that he could see.
You might note over here on the right that the parasol, lady on the extreme right here has a big parasol. That is not an umbrella. I don't
Notice
think.
her box camera too.
Oh, I didn't notice that. She has a box camera. And there's our dog in the front. That's right on the Montgomery Street side of the railroad bridge.
Now this is another good view of out on the railroad bridge. Now that's the custom house you see. And you can see it says customs on it. If you can I don't know if you can bring that in, but it says it. If you look at the picture close, you can see it. It says customs around the building. They would go out there. That's the tower you see where they went up to turn the bridge. And the custom house, they'd go out there. The trains would stop out there to have the customs officers get on the train, and or if they were on the train, they would get off there, whichever. And that's where they inspected the people. It was right out on that railroad bridge, right over the water.
You'll note also, though, again, you see the 4 tracks, 2 for each of the railroads that used it. It was a jointly owned, and expenses were shared because they both used.
Notice the curve in the railroad track if you look through the draw.
Way back, and the other you see that it starts to curve, and as it heads over toward Windmill Point, right?
But you wouldn't think they'd be straight across. You wouldn't think they'd put such a big curve, but because of the current, they had to curve the track. If it would have been perfectly straight, it would never stayed there. It would have went out the first winter.
Is this one of the? No, is this the home out here at all?
No, that's the tower you're
the
seeing.
tower
That's the
looking,
tower.
all right.
Yeah. Now, this is when the customs, there was a big storm and the customs kind of went in the lake.
You might say the customs were all wet in this picture. I've been told that when I used to work. And you see this building has kind of gone down in, kind of taking the plunge. Again, out on the draw area.
And that's what a storm did to the rails.
All right, this is frightening, and just shows you just a little bit of the storm. This north end, I guess, has kind of tipped downward, and the tracks are kind of crooked here a little bit, and take a lot of work to get them ready. They do it quite quickly, though, right?
Yeah, oh yes, it doesn't take all that long.
We'll take a short break right here. We just heard someone coming in. We'll find out who's in to see us and if they got anything important to tell us, and we'll be right back. We're back again. We're still looking at the Rutland Railroad and its history and its all it's done for the village of Rouses Point and the whole town of Champlain.
Yeah. Now these pictures, of course you all know, in 1962 the Rutland went out. And so then to save money, as fast as they could get rid of rails and towers and buildings, they did. And in the old railroad deeds, if that was your land, when they took it to build the railroad, that land had to go back to you. So that land they couldn't sell. So most of in Vermont, the land went back to the farmers, because a lot of places they cut the farmers' fields right in half to make the railroad. So it was agreed that if the railroad ever went out, the land went back to them. So this is a series of pictures that Willard Aubrey took when they took the tower down out on the drawbridge. I thought he did an excellent job.
Starts over on the left right here and comes across. You see the tower?
Yeah, then they were getting the crane up there, getting ready to light it.
And here's where they set it afire, and here's where it's coming down.
Yeah. And this is a load of scrap rail that they pulled up from the drawbridge, and they brought it to the state dock on a barge, and it was headed to Burlington. That had been bought and sold and bought there. So that was kind of interesting.
What goes up must come down.
And this is what the drawbridge looked like when they were going to decide to tear it down. That's the last drawbridge, and that's what it looked like.
Of course, many of us didn't see the drawbridge turn much because we were not out there. You just don't look out and see it. You don't always know it. We noticed the ones when they had it over the car bridge. We didn't see that one, but this was turning. Whenever that one turned, I guess this one turned, or even more so, because it had no height at all, really.
No height at all, no. And then after it was, that was down, the railroad sold. This is the way they started that part of the New York side turned into a fishing pier. And they platformed a lot of, they took the rails were gone, so they put platform and you could go out there and fish. They put a railing and they allowed you to go fish out there.
You'll see this is before the restaurant, before any of that,
that was the
area
first
right
thing
here.
After it was sold. That part was sold and it was made into a pier.
This was the sewer plant in that white building, just right here, that was part of their...
Yes.
That was the primary sewer plant in Rouses Point before they moved over to the other one at the end of Lily Street. That is a nice picture. It was a postcard that Peg has at Angler's Pier, the world's largest inland lake freshwater fishing pier, Rouses Point, New York, open in season every day, May through September.
So of course now that's right where the restaurant is now. The pier restaurant is at that same end. In 1932 there was it was right at just on the opposite side of the Sportsman's Pier, the opposite side of Montgomery Street. They used to store cars there. There was a lot of sidings and they kept empty cars in there. And in 1932 they found a man hung in one of the boxcars. He was a local man. It was Richard Martin. There was a carnival in town the week before, and it was always laid to that they think it was some kind of either a card game or something. And anyway, he was hung with his own belt in the corner of the car. I can remember that very distinctly. That everybody gathered to see what was going on. Of course, we couldn't get close to it, which we didn't want anyway. But that was another tragic thing that you know, and people that didn't have a lot of money couldn't hire lawyers or anything, so there never was anything done about it. So you never know if it was something that the man could have been saved or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think right now is the last thing for this time. Maybe somebody knows what this is. Now this is Rouses Point Station. It's Rouses Point's fire department. Now apparently they're waiting for something at the railroad station. It must be somebody pretty important, because look at the man on the horse with the top hat. But I don't know what it is. I have no clue as to what that could be.
He's either waiting for something or he's got lost.
But our fire department is there, so I thought it may be somebody of a big fire department conference or something to bring the fire truck there.
We don't know the year. We don't know anything.
I don't know anything about it, except it's a nice picture, and it's the Rouses Point Fire Department.
Yeah, well, you see, you have a fire truck, so you know that
yeah.
It's got a little bit of. It's got to be in the 20s or late 20s, early 30s, because of the vintage of the truck.
Yeah.
Which, of course, they sometimes use them for years, so it could be the horse. You can't tell. If we could see his teeth, Peg, I could tell you the age of the horse. All right. All right. What we have here is the final picture of this week's session with Peg Barcomb, and we hope you're enjoying this story of the railroad, because I don't think it's even 25% finished yet. But next Sunday, that'll be January the 6th, we'll be continuing on with the rest of the Rutland story and the beginning of the D&H, the other big railroad, which is still in existence in the village of Rouses Point and in the northern tier. We're very much indebted to Peg Barcomb for her donating all her time here, and not only the time that she spent right here, but the hours she has spent at home getting her pictures and her records in order. And just one more, maybe a place to stop. We have a nice colored picture here that we'd like to close out with. And it's the Napierville Junction, which has nothing to do with the Rutland, but it's on the Rutland tracks, or awfully close to it. It's located on Route 11 in the village of Moores. And I'm sure you recognize this as being the Playhouse, the great spot for Larry Marnes.
The history behind this caboose was his uncle's caboose. This was Larry's uncle's caboose on the NJ. So when Larry got a chance to buy it, he surely did. And it cost him more to get it brought to his yard than it did to buy the caboose. But so he's restored it. I made him covers for all the seats on the bunks in there, and I made him the shades for the windows, and he's brought the floor right back to the original wood floor. And he's got a caboose stove in it, and he's got it all just like when it was original. And if you go in there, he pushes a switch, and you hear a train coming down the track, and it's closer and closer and closer, and it blows, and you'd swear the train was coming right through the end of the caboose.
Right. So don't forget, if you enjoyed tonight's show, please tell Peg about it, tell myself, tell Calvin, but regardless, tune in next week again. You'll hear the rest of the Rutland story and the beginning of the D&H, or all of it, depending on our time. We've got a lot of information to show you. The history of railroads, romance of railroading in the village of Rouses Point, the town of Champlain. Thanks very, very much, Peg. And thank you for watching Hometown Cable, and particularly What's Going On Here. I'm Bob Zen. You watch it every Sunday night at 5 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 1 a.m., and again on 9 o'clock in the morning. If you like it, watch it all 4 times. And if you got a VCR, you can watch it forever. Thanks. Well, folks, we hope that you're going to be watching this coming Sunday night as we start the mini-series on the railroading in the northern tier. The first evening's episode, that's this coming Sunday, is going to be on the several railroads that have gone east and west in Rouses Point, particularly the northern, the Ogdensburg and Lake Champlain, and the Rutland. And here's one of the old cars that you'll hear about, the old engine, I should say, and the tender. You'll hear Peg Barcomb, who's sitting here with me, as she talks about the various wrecks. Here's one that took place in Champlain in 1916, and she'll be telling us about the construction of the wooden drawbridge over the lake as we cross from the New York to the Vermont side. That's coming up this Sunday night at 5 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 1 a.m. and 9 on early Monday morning, and that's the What's Going On Here show. I'm Bob Ben. I hope you can tune in, and tune in every night for Hometown Cable and every Sunday for something about your friends and neighbors. Thanks much for watching us.